This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I am your host, Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers, scholars, documentary filmmakers and other people who have done something to enrich us, people who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. And on our show today, our first guest will be Professor Ute Deichmann. She's a historian of science at Ben Gurion University of the Negev. She will tell us about the exchanges between Israeli and German scientists in the early years. Next year, the two countries will mark 50 years since the full normalization of diplomatic relations between them, and will inquire to what extent scientists paved the way. Hello, Ute, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello.
One of the only things I can say in German is the famous saying that's attributed to Bismarck. Die Politik ist keine exakte Wissenschaft. It means that politics is not an exact science, but it seems that it's, as far as the early exchanges between Israeli and German scientists go, the exact sciences had a lot to do with politics. Exakte Wissenschaft ist die Politik. So between the end of the war in 1945 and 20 years later, 1965, that is the year that relations were fully restored, what was the general attitude of Israeli scientists towards their colleagues in Germany? After all, Germany at the time was one of the powerhouses of scientific research. And also, of course, we shouldn't forget that many of the early Israeli scientists were of German origin.
Okay. Generally, it has to be said that Israel had already or established quite soon scientific relationships to other countries, to France and to the United States in particular, but there was no any relationship to Germany. And this was also politically not allowed. Mm-hmm. I mean, there was the Shilomim agreement, the reparations agreement, and it explicitly excluded cultural relations with Germany. And the Israeli...
Let's put it a bit in order, because the reparations agreement was signed in the early 50s, in 1953.
52.
Yeah,
yes.
And we're talking the relations between Israel and West Germany were fully normalized 13 years later in 1965. Right. So between that period, Israel could take West German money, but do very little else.
Yes, they took that money, and that's not, I mean, I'm not going to talk about that. Mm-hmm. Just to say that it did not restore any kind of cultural agreements, and the Israeli passports had a stamp saying for all countries except for Germany, and it was really something impossible to create relationships with Germany. I mean, there was military agreements between Defense Minister Peres and in Germany Defense Minister Strauss, but they were kept secret for a lot of time. Mm-hmm. And there were also exchanges between the BND and the Mossad, but also they remained secret. That was all in the 1950s.
Yeah.
No, but I think the scientific relations were the first really officially established relations between the two countries. And this was initiated by an Israeli scientist in 1956 already. Uh-huh. And that was a quite remarkable story. And this story is not related to any politics, but just to a personal biography of this particular scientist.
Mm-hmm. Who was he?
That was Gerhard Schmidt. He was a chemist at the Weizmann Institute. And in 1956, he became full professor and head of the Department of Crystallography. And Gerhard Schmidt was the son of a German non-Jewish chemist at the University of Munich. And this chemist had become even a member of the Nazi Party in 1933. And Gerhard had left Germany with his mother and ended up in England, and he got an excellent education.
But if he wasn't Jew, why did he have to leave Germany?
No, his mother was Jewish. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, for the Jews he was a Jew, for the Germans he was a half Jew, but that was enough to clearly not allow him to proceed anymore at school. He was a high school student at the time.
Right.
And and he got an excellent high school education. His father paid for it. I mean, it's not that he was bad to his family, but anyhow. And he got a graduate education at the crystallography department at the University of Cambridge under Dorothy Hodgkin, who is a Nobel laureate in crystallography. And in 1948, he was asked to establish a crystallography department in Israel. And actually, he was not a Zionist, but his wife at the time was. And so they agreed to come. Then his wife, Anita, she left after a year. She couldn't take it. She couldn't. Whereas Gerhard liked a little bit Wild West atmosphere in Rehovot, in the desert and so on. And he stayed on and established a very, very fine department. And his father urged him to visit him.
His father was still a professor in Munich, even after the war.
Yes, he remained a professor over there. But Gerhard always rejected it. He was full of resentment, as one can imagine.
Yeah. And how come his father was allowed to keep his job if he was married to a Jew and had a Jewish son? And even how did he join the Nazi party? Was it just to so-called cover his ass?
I cannot really tell about the motivation. There are people who say he did it in order to help his wife, which I can't believe, really.
It doesn't sound very
yes,
logical.
and anyhow, they got divorced. No? And he did not get out of the party afterwards. He stayed in the party, but he never assumed any political position or something like that. He was obviously somehow non-political. And he just pursued his studies in chemistry.
Right.
And so he was not affected by the denazification law, and he remained in his position afterwards.
Okay, so going back to Gerhard Schmidt, in 1956, so what motivated him to basically break the law and seek cooperation with Germany, if he was so resentful towards his father and his native country?
It was a personal visit, and he was resentful, but the father urged him so often. And I think after he became a full professor, he somehow had the courage or whatever to go to Germany as an equal. That's what I assume, but I cannot say. It just is the same year. And he came to visit his father, and probably his father had told him that he would introduce him to other scientists in Germany. And Gerhard, as a chemist, he was certainly interested in the chemistry in Germany because chemistry in Israel was largely based on agriculture still. There was no chemical industry. And if you wanted to work with industry, you had to go elsewhere. And Germany was the country to do it. And so his father introduced him to chemists in Munich, but especially at the University of Heidelberg. And also he introduced him to a physicist, Wolfgang Gentner, who was known to be a non-Nazi, and he was internationally respected because of that. And Gentner was head of a department at CERN. And also he became director of the Max Planck Institute for Nuclear Physics in Heidelberg.
Right.
And it was with Gentner that Gerhard Schmidt decided to try to establish scientific relations between the two countries.
Well, was anybody else in the loop? Or was it just, a personal initiative of Gerhard Schmidt?
In the beginning, it was a personal initiative, which was taken up by Wolfgang Gentner. Gentner had different motives. Gentner was frustrated about the boring situation of science in Germany after the war. And also the Allied control law did not allow Germans to pursue certain research, like in atomic physics. And he thought, German young students or graduate students could go to Israel to do some research they couldn't do in Germany. He wanted to open up the situation for young German scientists or students.
But what was the reaction that Schmidt got from his immediate surrounding? From the Weizmann Institute?
From the Weizmann Institute,
yeah.
No, the story is not yet finished.
Oh, okay.
And what happened then was that Amos de Shalit, who was a physicist, an Israeli physicist, also at the Weizmann Institute, but very internationally oriented. And he happened to be at CERN the same time that Gentner was there. And Gerhard Schmidt urged him to visit Gentner. And so these two basically establish the relation. Because Amos de Shalit had more power, he had more influence at the Weizmann Institute than had Gerhard Schmidt. And Amos de Shalit, if you ask me for his motives, it is difficult to say. He had no German background. But he was, as I said, internationally oriented. He wanted, and he had a vision for the future, and he wanted to integrate Israel more into the European system. He considered Israel as part of Europe, and he thought Germany could be a way to do it. At the time, Germany was still quite impoverished from the war effects, but it was very clear that the science was growing again, and there was the Marshall Plan, which really supported the economy and also science very strongly in Germany. And so de Shalit wanted to have these relations for that reason, but also he was, as he expressed often, and as the young people who went there, whom I interviewed, expressed all the time, he was interested in helping the young Germans overcome their international isolation.
So, ironically, in a way, Israel was the place to do it, not other European countries or the United States or the other rising powerhouses of science, but rather like you said, the Wild West, scientific Wild West of Israel. It doesn't really make sense.
It doesn't make sense, and it does make sense. It would have been impossible for any other countries. France, England, all the countries which had suffered from the German war effort were not ready to establish these close relations at the time. And the United States, the Jewish community, rather did not want to deal with Germans as a whole. They dealt with them as individuals, but not with the German community. They would not do it. And so Israel was indeed, ironically, the country which helped the Germans come back to the international arena. And that had to do with the pragmatism in the country. And basically.
So were there any other voices at the time that lamented this disconnect between the Israeli scientific community and the German one? And I'm talking mainly about scientists with some sort of German background because we know about German Jews who were forced out of the country, which they felt a great sense of belonging to, and they admired in many ways, and they were really sorry to leave. And after the war, there were, I'm assuming that with the denazification process and the reintroduction of Germany into the community of nations, I'm guessing that there should be some, if not many, Jewish Israeli scientists of German origin who would say, yes, we want to go back to our original environment.
No, I think the opposite was the case. Very much so. Gerhard Schmidt was quite an exception. But he was also cautious, trying to see with whom he would work. And Amos de Shalit, I should just say it, he made it very clear that he only wanted to deal with the younger generation or with people who were clearly anti-Nazi, which was impossible in the end, but at least that was his intention. And concerning the German Jews in Israel, there were many who came also as students, such as Elisabeth Goldschmidt, who was a professor of genetics at the time. And she and Jacob Berman, another person who came as a pupil from Germany who was expelled then, they made a big effort to prevent the International Genetics Congress taking place in Germany in the early 1960s. And they said it's not a place where we can go already now. No? So they really were very outspokenly against a normalization at the time.
Because they felt betrayed.
I guess so, yeah, and it is quite understandable. And it would relate, it would be similar to many Jewish people who had been expelled from Germany in the United States or England, who had the same kind of feeling.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, was this a sentiment that was shared by other ex-Germans who found refuge not in Israel but in other countries in the West?
Yes, very, very much so. And what they expected, some of them, of the renowned ones, they said, at least we expect an apology. And it never was done. Right? And also they were not asked to come back to Germany. I mean, it was difficult at the time because of the situation in Germany, but formally that the expulsion would have been acknowledged as an injustice, that wasn't done.
Were there any scientists in the West, in the States or in France or the UK or other countries who blatantly boycotted cooperation or scientific exchange with Germany, because there it was allowed to an extent, wasn't it?
Interestingly enough, there was a boycott against German science after the First World War. But there was no official boycott after the Second World War. And there are many reasons for that. I don't want to go into it. But despite that, there was kind of an unofficial boycott. And that means Germany was not excluded as a whole. But in conferences, Germans were invited as individuals. They were checked before concerning their behavior in the Nazi era. And also, I mean, Elisabeth Goldschmidt and Jakob Bormann, they had some personal contacts. That's not an overall kind of rejection, but they didn't want a normalization on the general
Interesting.
level.
So when were the ties between the Weizmann Institute and German universities formally realized?
Just what was in between, I should just tell you that. So when Amos de Chalit and Gerhard Schmidt tried to, they met together and it was very clear you couldn't do anything because of the political situation without involving Adenauer and Ben Gurion.
Yeah.
And they succeeded to involve both of them via, also interesting paths. And both Adenauer and Ben Gurion agreed.
When was that?
That was at the end of the 1950s.
Right.
And Ben Gurion made it on condition that it would not publicized.
So in a way, the scientific cooperation paved the way to the normalization of the full normalization of the ties between the two countries half a decade later.
Maybe, I can't really tell that. Maybe there were just negotiations in parallel. So that's it's something I simply don't know. No? But it was the first. But I should also tell you about the strong resistance that these efforts met at the Weizmann Institute and also in Germany. And so once the Ben Gurion and Adenauer agreed, Adenauer also helped the Israelis to get contact to the German power places. That means in economy and in politics and in science. And so the Max Planck Society was involved, and its president at the time was Otto Hahn. And he was invited, together with a small delegation, to visit Israel at the end of the 1950s. And when that became known, the people at the Weizmann Institute, the scientists and also the board, especially the board, was adamantly opposed to it. He said, so what, we will lose our standing in the international Jewish world and in the world as a whole if we collaborate with the institutions which played a part in the Holocaust, in the Shoah.
But what was their opposition in Germany?
In Germany, it took place a little late. I mean, there was an opposition in principle of some members of parliament, or some, it was quite a big fraction, who preferred ties with the Arab world. And it was economically more rewarding, and so there were reasons for that.
I see.
No, and that would be really a problem to have these connections with Israel.
Sure.
Right? And then there was the Hallstein doctrine. It's a foreign policy doctrine, which said that Germany cuts any diplomatic contact with countries which acknowledge the GDR, the East German country, East Germany. East Germany, and so they were afraid that the Arabs would acknowledge East Germany once they have ties with Israel.
Right.
That would be a very strong economic blow.
Yeah.
And so that was a reason why they were opposed.
Very interesting. Professor Ute Deichmann, I'm afraid this is all we have time for. So thank you very much for coming in and telling us about scientific cooperation between Israel and West Germany. In the early years, you are the director of the Jacques Loeb Center for the History and Philosophy of Life Sciences at Ben Gurion University here in Beersheba. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me.